Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about. For this episode, Debbie and I teamed up for a fantastic conversation with Mike Madrid. Mike is the co-founder of the Lincoln Project, a longtime political consultant, and author of an excellent new book, The Latino Century: How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. This is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand how elections, including in 2024, will be won or lost, and whether the United States will remain a vital, diverse, optimistic country. Enjoy. Mike Madrid, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
It's so great to be with you guys. I appreciate you having me.
You have written an absolutely fabulous new book, The Latino Century. I hope everybody goes out and pre-orders it. It'll be coming out in June. And we are going to talk a lot about that, your efforts at the Lincoln Project and beyond. I want to start by talking about, I think the two themes of your book that really resonated with me was this idea that we really need to center campaigns and our governance around the idea of pluralism and optimism. And that is something that feels absent from almost all of our campaigns today. Can you talk about why you believe those values are not only important, but can win?
Yeah, and let me start with the important piece first. Is it's actually a necessary attribute for, I think, any society, but certainly a democracy to continue. And as somebody who's been involved in kind of pro-democracy efforts and fighting off some of the really scary stuff that's happening, particularly on the right-wing side of the American political spectrum at this time, there is this kind of politics of grievance that has set in with a wide swath of Americans. And unfortunately, sometimes beating that requires you to engage in that same type of conflict. And the big question before I began writing the book was what happens to a society if you become what you're fighting? Are you really winning, right? And I think that we're very close to kind of tipping into that area, into that space. And so then that begs the question, what is required to kind of protect American democracy? And I think you articulated it perfectly with the question is we tend to focus at this moment in time where there's a very real fragility to our system. And it's very real. I'm engaged in all of these fights. We talk a lot about the reforms to the Constitution. Should we increase the size of the Supreme Court? Should we track down dark money? Should we have better guardrails against foreign influence in spending money into our elections? The answers to that is probably yes on all of those fronts. But the one thing that I think I'm constantly inspired by is the fact that there is no constitution that you can draw up that is strong enough to protect itself from a people that don't want to be governed by it. Mm. And until we solve for that problem, all these other reforms, may help along the margins, but they're not getting to the root of what is ailing the American body politic at this point in time. And what I found through the course of 30 years of working with the Latino community, but most specifically the data on this book, is the seeds of reinvention and reinvigorating the American idea, and I believe the continuity of the American experiment itself, is literally within our own DNA. This group, this rapidly emerging part of the electorate and the population, has a very high level of confidence in the social institutions that are required to make democracy work. There's a very high level of trust in even the institutions that may not have served them well. And that trust and confidence in institutions is literally the fundamental underpinnings of democracy, of any society, truly, but especially democracy. And as much as we're going to try and should over the course of the next few years, decades, to reinforce those institutions which have so eroded in public consciousness, the good news is every day that we wake up demographically, we are adding more and more people to the voter rolls that already innately have that trust and confidence in these institutions.
Yeah, I was so struck by that specific part of the book too. And I mean, I just have to say, since it's my first, I just absolutely love this book, and I think that every New Deal reader and every listener should read it. It's really, it's so chock full of history and data and case studies state by state of the Latino vote. But I mean, really fascinating, interesting stuff. But I think Ryan started at the right place, which was, is this larger issue of, how restoring our faith in government. And I came away from your book very optimistic and very heartened, actually. And I appreciate that. And I was also struck kind of by your comment about the young nature of the Latino vote and the Latino part of our society, and how different that looks to some of our older voters who have really lived in kind of this unprecedented era of prosperity and peace, who ironically actually are the ones who are most distrustful of our institutions in our in our system. So I think that that's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition you were painting there. But I want to ask a question a little bit about something that was kind of also a big theme of the book for me, and really struck me as super important, which is the assertion that you make, kind of that, and the data you lay out to back up the assertion over the book, that neither party, neither Democrats or Republicans, have been able to crack the code, particularly in laying out a compelling economic agenda for Latino voters in this country, and that really has been the downfall of both parties, and that's the struggle, right? Or that's the opportunity, maybe the better way to say it. That's the opportunity. The party who can understand that those are the issues that Latino voters care most about, and articulate a compelling economic agenda for them, will win the day. So can you just talk a little bit about that, like how you came to understand that, and what you think needs to happen going forward for the party that's going to be successful in that realm?
Wow, a great question. This is going to be a good conversation. I'm glad you guys really jumped into the book here. So thanks. I feel like it's not just me. There are people who actually want to, are interested in what's happening here. Look, let me say this. I think the best way to kind of enter into the conversation is to say that Latinos are the fastest growing segment of the blue collar working class segment of our society. It is the non-college voter and the industries that employ them that are increasingly being filled by people with Hispanic surnames. And we are at a moment in American history where the education divide, as we call it, is the single largest demarcation of political attitudes, meaning that the Democratic Party is very rapidly consolidating college-educated voters under its banner, and the Republican Party is equally as dramatically consolidating non-college educated voters under its banner. And so in many ways, this working class, both culture and economic issues are a natural function of this divide as it's happening. But I want to speak specifically about, because I do believe, and I'm going to speak through kind of partisan terms here. I mean, I'm a Republican, but I'm a Lincoln Project Republican, and I've worked for Democrats, which puts me in a very unique space in American history. There's not a lot of people that can say that. You can probably say it on one hand. But what I will say is that 1 in 5 Hispanic men work in the residential construction space or a related field. That is an astonishing number. Astonishing. 1 in 5. And this is oftentimes related to the not just swinging hammers, although that's true, but it's also the professional classes of being a realtor or a mortgage broker, for example. And at a time when interest rates have tripled, the economic impact to the Latino community it's a gut punch, it's a sucker punch to household incomes, to a wide swath of the Latino economy. And when you recognize that Latinos are younger, which puts us at earlier part in our earning years, the devaluation of our currency, 25% with inflation over the past 4 years, really hits the lower class, working class, blue collar class hard. So when we ask the question of whether Latinos are better off now economically than they were 4 years ago, quantifiably they were better off 4 years ago. Now, I'm not going to prescribe who did what and how they did it. I'm not interested in that. We can debate that all day long, or maybe not, because we're probably in agreement that Joe Biden's been an immeasurably better president than Donald Trump. But in terms of the reality of every day of waking up and recognizing that working class families need relief, regardless of what the causes were or who did what or how it came to be, our working class is under extraordinary pressures, especially in California. And we need to have, as you said, a New Deal party again that is focused primarily on working class people. And that is not today's Democratic Party at all, as a function of this education divide. The Democratic Party is actually getting older, wealthier, more progressive, and much more animated by cultural issues than economic issues. There's a reason why Gavin Newsom is running abortion rights ads in Tennessee. It's because those are the issues that animate the Democratic base, and he's trying to drive that discussion. He's not talking about poverty issues or working class issues or economic mobility issues or housing issues much. It's getting to the point where he has to more, but until the Democratic Party recognizes that it's got to get back to its working class roots, it's going to continue to leak these Latino voters to the right. And sorry about the long answer, but let me also say this. I make this very clear in the book. I'm, as somebody who's been working in GOP politics for the better part of 25, 30 years, I do not believe that Republicans are getting more Latino votes despite their best efforts, not because of them. They're not doing anything that is bringing Latino voters to the polls. There's just a broad disaffection and disaffiliation from both parties, and there may be one or two issues that is grabbing the heart and imagination election cycle by election cycle, especially amongst the U.S. born.
Just to get to the heart, to the essence of your argument, you have one chapter on what the Republicans get wrong about Latino voters, and you have another chapter about what Democrats get wrong. Can you talk briefly about, what each party gets wrong, and then who's going to win with what message?
Yeah. Okay. So, the book actually began as kind of an examination of these two, because I've worked on both sides and I've seen what they both do. It's not really conjecture. I'm kind of one of the few practitioners that's done this. Let's start with the Democratic Party, because we were kind of there anyway. But broadly, whichever party is able to capture the hearts and minds of a multi-ethnic working class people is going to dominate our politics for the next 20, 30 years. And the Democrats have a problem with the working class piece, as I mentioned. Republicans have a problem with the multi-ethnic piece. Okay. And so reconciling those two is actually key. It's critical. And the tensions in the Democratic coalition right now were actually on display in the California state legislature just 48 hours ago. There was a really big bill that came out that was focused on density in coastal communities. The Coastal Commission, as you know, has really restricted all types of building from top to bottom, but especially high density housing. And virtually every white progressive in the coast voted against density. All the Latino Democrats in the legislature voted for it. And that's one of those class issues where housing particularly is going to test the coalition in the Democratic Party, which is comprised largely, the leadership is largely white, progressive, college educated, and upper income. The voting base increasingly is younger, poor, browner, and non-college educated. They have very little in common except for one thing. They really hate Republicans for their own reasons. And that has been the glue that has kept this coalition together until now in California, where you're seeing these class and economic and housing issues start to tear at the fabric of the coalition. arguably because the Republicans are so irrelevant in California. But this rightward shift that we're seeing primarily outside of the state is really a function of the glue of that coalition, that distaste for republicanism waning a little bit, ironically, in the Trump era. But that seems to be what's happening.
Do you want to take a stab at the Republicans? I mean, it came down to one sentence in your books. You said Republicans don't be racist. I'll say don't what be you racist. Said.
Yeah, it's really complicated. Just quit being racist. and look, it's as simple as it is. As somebody who's worked in the party for a long time, it's really hard for them. And I'm not saying that every Republican is racist, but I am saying that 90% of them voted for a racist for president, quantifiably. And so even if you're not racist, the fact that you vote for and support for racists, is a problem. It is a moral issue. But let me make it even more the practical political case. There's this conventional belief and idea that Donald Trump, who's getting near historic levels of Hispanic support, is some sort of Pied Piper, or he's doing something secret, or he's found the silver bullet to get Latinos to vote for him. And I argue that's not true at all. In fact, if you look at Republican governors like Ron DeSantis in Florida, or Greg Abbott in Texas, Doug Ducey, the last Republican governor of Arizona, even Brian Dahle, a name that most people don't know, who was the Republican nominee that ran against Gavin Newsom a couple years ago as he ran for governor, his reelection, they all outperformed Donald Trump with Hispanic voters. And in California and nationwide, virtually every competitive congressional district that has Hispanic dense precincts showed the Republican outperforming Donald Trump, which is a strong indicator that Donald Trump isn't leading Latinos to the Republican Party. He's actually limiting what would be an otherwise larger swing, because more Latinos are voting for other Republicans than Donald Trump. He's literally in the way of Hispanics voting probably 44% for Republican candidates, which would completely change the balance of power in this country. And so I don't believe for a moment that Donald Trump is aiding Republicans. I think he's a hindrance to that shift in that movement. And the best thing they can do is just don't be racist, because they're getting these voters despite their best efforts, like I was saying, as they're speaking to white, non-college educated voters, that iconic, diner conversation the New York Times is having in West Virginia and Ohio and Tennessee. Those voters are demographically being replaced by browner faces with Hispanic surnames on the job site. And we shouldn't be surprised that they're voting and taking on the same economic politicization as their counterparts. And so if Republicans could just stop with the nativism, just stop with the anti-Latino immigrant rhetoric, they would be seeing, and supporting those candidates, they would be seeing a more significant shift than they're already getting.
Can I think that's absolutely right. And I want to ask about, you have a couple things in this book that lead from there about, like, I think are, maybe would be surprising. Like when I think that maybe are mischaracterizations within, I don't know, the political class about how to think about Latino voters that really struck me. So I'm going to violate the single subject rule we have here in California, so, and pack a couple in. But one is that that Black, to what you just said, that your argument is that actually the Democratic Party is being pulled by, white college educated to the left, and that the Republican Party is being pulled to the right by non-college white voters, and that the Black and brown folks are actually now your moderate voters, which I think is really something that probably the way, at least in the Democratic circles, that's not necessarily how I hear it talked about a lot. And I think that that's super important, something I agree with, something that I think is super important. And the other thing you say is you make the point that, to your point about kind of Republicans are trying hard and, despite their best efforts doing well, you also make the point that, to that point, about choice potential and the Dobbs decision potentially saving the Democratic Party for a few more years at least, and I think that that's something that would be surprising for some people. They think Latino, they think conservative, right? Probably anti-choice. That's not true. At least that's not what's in your book. So,
correct.
So what about some of these kind of misperceptions about Latinos would you point out for people?
Yeah. So the answer to both of those questions is really, it shows how strong the need is for both parties to create essentially a caricature of Latino voters, a stereotype, and say, what do we need to do to talk to this voter, right? And who is this voter? And what I have learned in studying race, ethnicity, identity, and politicization as a practitioner and a researcher for 3 decades now is it's not that clean cut, right, with any group, but certainly not with a group that is both showing strong assimilative tendencies, as Latinos are, but also because of the size and the scope of the change, a very strong racial and ethnic sensitivity that doesn't exactly leave after a second or third generation. And what that means is both parties are choosing their stereotypes of who Latino voters are, and both are wrong. So and both parties, by the way, the leadership in both parties are overwhelmingly white in their structure. They're overwhelmingly white in their political consulting ownership of their firms. Like 90% of these of firms on both the Republican and Democratic side are white-owned firms. Polling is overwhelmingly a white industry. And I say that not to be critical, but because I think that the approach on some of these questions needs to be understood through that lens. There is a strong pull to believe that any non-white voter is essentially some type of an aggrieved racial minority voter on the Democratic side of the aisle. That is quantifiably false, demonstrably false. Yet that's the orthodoxy of the party, and there are a lot of people who perpetuate that, including Latino politicians, because it gives them leverage in the party. It gives them cameras. It gives them money. It gives them the messaging that works for their constituency. And the irony of the fact that a lot of this narrative is driven largely by white college-educated progressives, and that's not a pejorative. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying this is a natural demographic thing, leads to kind of the Latinx conversation, where more white progressives use Latinx than Latinos are even aware of it. It's the genuine, I think, sincere attempt by progressives to say, how can we right historical wrongs? How can we create more opportunity? How can we make a more equitable society? Those are all virtuous. Those are good things. But the best thing you can probably do is simply listen to the voters and respond to what they're saying. And for 30 years, at least, maybe 50 years, Latinos have been telling us overwhelmingly our primary concerns are economic. And so until you get back to economic opportunity and allow me to rise my own economic mobility, I'm not really going to be listening to the oppressed racial arguments that are supposed to sort of make me feel better about being a Democrat. And so Republicans, for their part, have always had this very simplistic belief that we should just all drop the hyphen, quit being a hyphenated American, and just be an American. We should all just be American. I hear this all the time. And essentially what that argument is can you just be white? Like, just be like us, melt into us, and we'll accept you. And that's not, I think there was a time when that was perhaps acceptable thinking. It certainly is not now, as America is becoming a non-white majority country. In 8 years, for the first time, America will be a non-white majority country. And so the melting pot metaphor doesn't work anymore. When we were an 80% white country, you could melt into that 80% and sort of slowly disappear and lose your hyphen and drop your culture and your bag, your mother country's baggage at the door, and adopt kind of whatever American culture is. Although I would argue there's not much of it. That's not going to work when most of us are not of white European ancestry, and we're very close to that mother country. The cultural reinforcement of Mexico specifically it's right there. I mean, this was Mexico. Santa Cruz is, there's a name for that, right? And all of this historical legacy is a part of that. And so I guess what I'm saying and suggesting is the Republican Party has always had this very cosmetic, very shallow understanding of American national identity, completely unmoored and unanchored from ethnic and cultural considerations, and believed erroneously that you could just drop all of those important things that are meaningful to us as human beings and become American. And as long as you flew an American flag and had a screaming eagle on your shoulder and had hot dogs on the 4th of July, that would replace everything that thousands of years of culture forged in you. And that's just not the way that it works.
So can I ask, I mean, building meaningful policies to help the working class, blue collar, developing that trust and relationship, that takes a long time. We have an election in 5 months that is going to be the most consequential of our lifetimes. What do you recommend that can be done, especially in the swing states, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, that you cite in your book, to win this election in the short term, knowing that this is actually a much longer conversation for the country?
Yeah, and it's important as a setup. This rightward shift didn't start in 2020. It actually began around 2012. The high watermark was when Barack Obama got 75% of the Hispanic vote, extraordinary number. Hillary Clinton drops about 7-8 points, and then Biden drops another 7-8, and now he's sitting in 59% in 2020. The polling is now like 45-55, and everyone's kind of hitting the panic button. It would be the great irony of ironies, I think, but it wouldn't be terribly surprising if Donald Trump were elected largely on the votes of Latino voters. That's going to be a cause of an extraordinary amount of self-reflection as Latinos and as Americans, and for both parties to say what is going on. That's a big part of what my book is really seeking to answer. And I'm not making a prediction, but what I can say because I believe it's equally as likely that Donald Trump will get 45% of the Hispanic vote as Joe Biden pushing that vote back down to the low 30s, high 20s. I think both are very possible. And so the question becomes, well, how? What does he need to do? The first is, in terms of the centrality of economic issues, I brought up housing for a very specific reason. There needs to be a Marshall Plan for Latino housing and home ownership. Literally, call it that, specifically that, and use all of the strength and substance of the federal government to bring that to bear. Look, there's not a whole lot of control the president has over interest rates, but you can certainly use first-time homebuyer tax credits, for example. You can certainly use deduction abilities on taxes. You can do federal credits for down payment assistance. There's a whole arsenal of things that you can use specifically to first-time home buyers that will disproportionately benefit Latinos getting into the system. The second is, and this move that Joe Biden has made in January towards a stronger border security position is absolutely the right way to go, not just for centrism, because that's where most Americans are at. There's virtually no distinction between Latinos and non-Hispanic whites on the border issues. Latinos by big numbers are saying we need border security. It's not inherently racist to say you want border security. It's one of the basic functions of government. And the apprehension of Democrats to do that has opened them up to unfair attacks by Republicans to say, well, you're open border. Nobody is for open borders. Nobody that I know is for open borders. There's no such thing. But when you don't have a policy to respond to, it leaves some questions in the minds of not just white voters, but of Latino voters. And some of the most significant rightward shifts that we've seen in the country are happening along the border where Latinos, U.S.-born Latinos live, because they're seeing the problem most acutely. So I think the more that the Democratic Party, and this is where a big tension starts to come in, can start to advocate for some of those New Deal policies. With the private sector, by the way, because another good question is, well, if this is true, Mike, what about Build Back Better? What about all these investments that we were making in bridges and roads and all this stuff? And there's a lot of truth to that. But if anybody here's from a working class or blue collar, family, building a bridge in 10 years doesn't pay rent on Friday. And that may be great, but it's not real until it's real. And unfortunately for working class and lower class people, reality is Friday usually. There's not a longer horizon, and those policies need to be built for the benefit of people who've got to pay rent on Friday.
I want to switch gears for a second and talk a little bit about you.
Yep.
You write really eloquently in your book about, or very openly, I guess is the right word, in your book about kind of what drew you to the Republican Party to begin with, and how the Republican Party has largely, you feel, abandoned you, now, and as particularly as a co-founder of the Lincoln Project, which I believe most of our listeners will be well familiar with and probably fans of. I do love your comment. I told Ryan I was going to say this. Your comment about like. I'll paraphrase. I don't have it in front of me, but this idea that if a group of political consultants is the moral compass for the Republican Party, we're in trouble, right?
Yeah,
the line.
That's how bad it's got. That's how bad it is.
That was hilarious, but seriously, this idea that what you talk about in your book of being drawn to the Republican Party as a youngster because of Reagan and the shining city on the hill, and this idea that of strength and patriotism, but also a welcoming place, has now kind of been bastardized or abandoned, maybe largely by the Republican Party as an entity. And so I guess I just would love to hear you talk about kind of, that evolution and your work with the Lincoln Project and how important that's been. You guys, you put your life, you put yourselves out there. Like a lot of our elected officials we work with, you've had death threats, you've had, this is not an easy thing to do, right? So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for what you're doing and your colleagues. But talk about why you thought that was so important in this moment in time to be on the front lines and put yourself out there like this. Yeah,
I appreciate the question and thank you for the kind comments. Let me start with the Reagan piece, and then we'll get to the Lincoln Project stuff, because a lot of people are like, well, Donald Trump is here because of Reaganism, right? I hear that a lot, and I don't begrudge people for thinking that. I think it's entirely inaccurate for a lot of reasons, and those reasons I think are really central to why this Mexican American kid in Ventura County became Republican. And like, how could that possibly be a philosophy that worked for you? You mentioned the Shining City on the Hill speech. It's really central to the answer to that. And Republicans often, quote the Shining City on the Hill to talk about American exceptionalism, but they stop after the sentence where Reagan says, the hills are windswept and God blessed. The Shining City on a Hill speech is at its core an immigration speech, because the very next line, which he purposely and put into that speech as his goodbye, as his farewell, essentially to the American people from the Oval Office, says, if you must have walls, there needs to be a wide open door for anybody who is wanting to come to America. You cannot believe in American exceptionalism if you are anti-immigrant. You cannot believe in the idea that we have a better system for human beings and then cut them out. Those are completely inconsistent. If you believe in the abundance of America, that this idea of America is a gift to the world, exceptionalism, a shining city on the hill, if you believe that, if you accept that, then you must, by definition, allow those who are coming to benefit from that. And that's the exact opposite of what Trumpism is, which is this really toxic, cowardly sense of isolationism and protectionism and nationalism, nativism, I would also argue too, these dangerous isms, which are all grounded in fear and insecurity. They're all based in the idea of scarcity, that American ideas are not sufficient enough to take care of ourselves, let alone be a beacon of light to the world. And I don't believe it's imperialistic to simply be a beacon and show people that we can and have a better way. I don't, and I believe that to my core. But what I do believe is that there was a moment, and I can tell you pretty much exactly when the moment was, when the Republican Party was a party that believed genuinely in American exceptionalism, pro-immigrant, pro-immigration, and universalism towards the idea of lifting all people, which are endowed by our Creator. Not some people, not white people, all people, right? That's the American creed. And that moment was when the Twin Towers were struck. The Republican Party changed foundationally after that. It became a frightened, fearful, cowardly party, afraid to talk about its ideas and its beliefs. And you never heard a Republican nominee from that moment on for president talking about immigration being central to the idea of American exceptionalism. And it doesn't shock me at all to think that, George W. Bush, whose campaign, I was a part of, and Ronald Reagan were both the most pro-Mexico presidents, Republican or Democrat, I would argue, in living memory, and got the highest level of Latino support historically, because they viewed Mexico as an ally and as a brother, and they benefited from that, not just politically, but I think our country benefited by that for a whole host of reasons. And again, I contrast that. I attended. I went back to the Reagan Library during this last presidential debate cycle in the primaries, and there's Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and Ron DeSantis advocating bombing Mexico unilaterally, invading Mexico. These are issues, these are policy positions dramatically to the crazy extreme right of where Donald Trump was in 2016. And it shows you how deeply corrupted the Republican Party has become, where it wasn't even that big of a deal. Like unilaterally invade Mexico, bomb Mexico. Like, that's their policy positions, right? It's not crazy was the build the wall chance in 2016. It's exponentially worse. And remember, Donald Trump wasn't even at these debates. That's just common policy position now amongst Republicans. It's not serious, but it's dangerous. And it needs to be taken seriously because it is so flippant. But it's all undergirded by this fear, this cowardice, this lack of confidence in America and American ideals, which takes me to the Lincoln Project, where you have 8 political consultants who formed the Lincoln Project right as the first impeachment hearings were beginning, in large part because we knew a lot of these were our clients, a lot of these were people we helped get elected, that they were going to refuse to see the evidence before they made judgment. But let's remember what that was, is Donald Trump's voice was on a recorded phone call leveraging Zelensky to dig up fake political dirt on Joe Biden in order to give him weapons to defend himself against Russian aggression. Like if there was ever a textbook definition on why somebody should be impeached, that's it. And they voted not to even allow the evidence. Why? Because the evidence was so damning. That's why. We heard it anyway, but they didn't make it a part of it so that they could, excuse it and dismiss it as partisan. And at that point, we realized we're not just dealing with a difference of opinion. We're not just dealing with incompetence. We're not just dealing with one nefarious bad actor. We're dealing with an entire political party that we've spent our entire lives advocating for, that has been corrupted from top to bottom and is now an existential threat to the country. It is a danger to the republic. It's not that we just didn't like them. It's not that we wanted to argue over marginal tax rates. This is a threat to the republic. And so I think every one of us felt we had no choice but to, as Americans. And I'm still to this day, disheartened by the fact that it took political consultants to be the moral backbone of the party. Like when political consultants are the good guys, it tells you how bad it was. But also, that there weren't more voices. That will always hurt me. Not just at that moment, although particularly at that moment, but now. And I'm grateful for Liz Cheney, and I'm grateful for Adam Kinzinger, and I've had conversations with these people and with Mitt Romney sometimes. But where were they in 16? We knew what the threat was. Where were they in 2020? And George Conway, who's become a good friend, counsels me regularly. It doesn't matter right now. The threat is existential. Whoever is willing to join the forces, give them a rifle and have them take the hill, because we need everybody fighting at this moment. I still have trouble with that. I'm not going to lie about that. I still personally, because it did cost us so much, and I would gladly do it again. By the way, gladly, I'm doing it again now. But it cost me my business. It cost me a lot of my quote unquote friends. My family was put in danger numerous times. The death threats and packages at my house, and it's a horrible thing that you would not ever expect in this country. But you do it in large part. The main motivator is if we don't stand up now, this is going to get worse. And that's one of the things that that's a horrible thing to be motivated by. But I'm not gonna say anything other than that was actually a big part of it. Is I'm scared now, but if we back down now, this gets worse. This gets harder to defend against. And sorry about the long answer, but those are some of the thoughts. That's the journey that I've been on.
So how are you feeling going into 2024? And what's the Lincoln Project's plan? And what do you think?
Yeah, let me say this. I'm the data guy. I was the guy who does the data. It's not the sexy stuff, and a lot of the ads. I had probably about 5% ad. The country got to know the Lincoln Project because of the ads, and that's why we became a pop culture phenom. But beneath the surface, we were doing actual, real political work, and it was by far the most advanced, sophisticated team that I've ever worked with. But we were very small, by the way. It's me and like 4 or 5 guys. And other people that were just willing to sacrifice their careers to jump on. And I say that because I'm very proud of what we did. We were fighting the Death Star. I mean, Brad Parscale had spent $100 million on his data operation and probably had 45 very sophisticated data guys. And that was just kind of, the 5 of us doing the best we could. Really, let me take voters back a little bit just to remember here. Once Donald Trump is acquitted from the impeachment, it looks very, very much like Bernie Sanders is going to become the nominee. We have to remember Joe Biden was coming like 6th in that big candidate field. He got no traction until South Carolina. And so he rolls into South Carolina and does very well on Super Tuesday, essentially locks up the nomination, and then COVID hits. And this is very important for history to remember because the Democratic nominee couldn't leave his house to raise money. And Donald Trump was sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars, enormous war chest, the bully pulpit of the presidency, in a campaign that had been functioning for 4 years. And Biden's campaign is broke. His numbers are not strong, and he can't campaign. And that was where the Lincoln Project filled the void. Is we jumped into the abyss and said, we'll be David and take on Goliath. We'll be that little sailboat taking on an aircraft carrier to allow Biden to catch up. That was, I think, the great benefit we played for the Biden campaign and for the country and for the Democratic Party. That windup is all because Joe Biden doesn't face those challenges, and I know everybody's looking at the polling from a data perspective. I believe that Joe Biden is actually the fundamentals lean towards a very, very strong likelihood of a Biden reelect. Very strong. Now, having said that, the weaknesses in the base are real, but they are also very real for Trump. And you'll notice, for close observers, and my guess is a lot of your listeners probably are, Joe Biden keeps having this persistent polling problem that does not show up on election day. When elections are actually held, he's getting like 90% of the vote, which is higher than a historical range for any candidate, anybody running against two no names. Trump has election day problems that don't show up in his polling. His polling looks very, very strong, but on election day, he's losing 20% of the vote to a candidate that dropped out 2 months ago. Like, that's a problem. That's a problem in the base. And so just on that, there's a lot of other data sets we won't bore your audience with, but just on that, which candidate would you rather be? You'd rather be the candidate with the polling problem, but no problem on election day. Like that, 100 times out of 100, that's what you want. And that's Joe Biden. Joe Biden's problems are not materializing on the ground. And my strong sense is that the base that is weak will largely consolidate. At the same time, Donald Trump risks leaking a historic level of Republican support. So that's why my basic framework is I feel good about the fundamentals of this race. Now, having said that, I'm not exactly happy with what I'm seeing coming from the Biden campaign. I don't like what's happening, particularly with Latino voters. I think there's kind of this sense that they're going to lose the vote in the high 30s, maybe in the low 40s, and they're just kind of throwing up their hands and accepting it as they pursue more white college-educated Republican voters. Mathematically, that's actually probably the right decision, but I think it's too high of a risk, a gamble, and then I think it's unnecessary. I think that they can and still should be fighting for a larger share of this vote. I'm not seeing it. I would like to see it. And it's the one thing that gives me great pause because, like I said, if Donald Trump does win, it will be in large part because Latinos put him back in office.
Well, Mike Madrid, I can't tell you how fun this conversation was, both energizing, a little bit concerning. I think my emotions ran the gamut, but all of it, which I guess that's kind of just where we are right now as a country. But again, I want to thank you not just for coming on the show, but for your work and for this book, The Latino Century, How America's Largest Minority is Transforming Democracy. Can't recommend the book highly enough to everybody. And just, really thank you for all. I feel like we've all got to hunker down and just to get through November and make sure that this, that the Biden wins and that we, have so we can have these conversations about community and about rebuilding democracy in a way that we're not in the middle of an existential threat again. So let's hope that's where we are, and we'll have you back on after the election.
You guys, it means a lot to me to the words of kindness. I appreciate you taking time with the book and for giving me an opportunity to talk to your listeners. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.